Do you ever feel like the world around you is moving too fast, leaving you behind? The people you love, the ones you raised with care, now seem distant, almost as if you've become invisible. The pain of being ignored, the sting of feeling unappreciated, can be overwhelming. But here's a truth few will tell you. You still hold the power to change everything. This is not a story of regret. This is a story of rediscovery, of reclaiming the life and respect you deserve. Let's begin. Tanaka sat in his quiet living room, the walls around him filled with memories. Framed photos lined the shelves. His children as toddlers, their tiny hands wrapped around his fingers, their teenage years beaming with pride at school ceremonies, and finally their graduations, standing tall beside him, eyes filled with promise and gratitude. But those moments now felt like echoes of a lifelong past. His once bustling home had become a silent sanctuary, where only the ticking of the clock kept him company. The phone, once a lifeline to laughter and warmth, now lay untouched on the table, a mere decoration collecting dust. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mr. Tanaka dialed his son's number, hoping, just hoping, that this time he would pick up. He listened as the line rang, a hollow sound stretching through the silence. Once, twice, 3 times, then the familiar, indifferent voice of an automated message. "The number you have dialed is currently unavailable. Please leave a message after the tone." He sighed, pressing the phone against his forehead, as if the warmth of his skin could somehow fill the emptiness in his heart. This wasn't the first time his calls had gone unanswered. It had become routine, like a ritual of disappointment he had unwillingly subscribed to. The frustration simmered within him, an ache so deep it almost felt physical. He wanted to yell, to demand an explanation. "Why don't you call me back? Don't you care? After everything I've done for you, is this what I deserve?" The words clawed at his throat, but something stopped him from saying them. Instead, he put the phone down and stood up, feeling the weight of his emotions pressing on his chest. He needed air. He needed to escape the suffocating silence. Slipping on his coat, he stepped outside, letting the crisp evening breeze wash over him. The park wasn't far, a place he used to take his children when they were young. Back then, they would run ahead of him, laughing as they chased each other through the trees. He would watch from a bench, his heart swelling with love, knowing that these were the moments that made life worth living. Now those same trees stood tall and unwavering, their leaves rustling softly in the wind. But the laughter was gone. The only sound was the distant hum of the city and the occasional chirping of crickets. He walked slowly, his hands tucked into his pockets, his mind racing through memories. He thought about the late nights spent helping with homework, the sacrifices he made so his children could have a better life. He remembered the way they used to cling to him as children, seeking comfort in his arms. And then he thought about now. How had they drifted so far apart? When had he become just another obligation they didn't have time for? He sat down on a bench and exhaled deeply, staring at the path ahead. The truth hit him like a wave. His worth was not measured by how often his children called. His value was not defined by their attention. For years he had poured every ounce of himself into fatherhood, believing that love was something given, something selfless. But somewhere along the way, he had forgotten something crucial. He was not just a father. He was a man. A person with dreams, with dignity, with a life that extended beyond the role he had played for his children. And just because they no longer called as often did not mean he had lost his purpose. A soft smile formed on his lips as he leaned back, gazing up at the sky. He would not let their absence define him. He had spent a lifetime being strong for them. Now it was time to be strong for himself. As he rose from the bench and began walking home, a sense of clarity settled over him. He no longer felt the need to check his phone, no longer felt the urge to dwell on unanswered calls. Because in that quiet moment, he had found something far more powerful than their validation. He had found peace. Window, staring out at the empty street. The house was quiet, too quiet. A silence so heavy it felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. She could still remember the days when this house was filled with life. The echoes of laughter, the sound of hurried footsteps running up and down the stairs, the warmth of family dinners where conversations overlapped and stories spilled into the night. But now, all of that was gone. Her children had moved away, their lives consumed by work, families of their own, responsibilities that left little room for visits or long conversations. At first she understood. They were busy. Everyone was. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks stretched into months, she realized something painful. She was waiting. Waiting for the phone to ring. Waiting for someone to remember her. Waiting for proof that she still mattered. One afternoon, she picked up her phone and scrolled through old messages. The last one from her daughter was 2 months ago. A simple, "Sorry, Mum, been busy. I'll call soon." But soon had never come. Her fingers hovered over the call button. She hesitated, then set the phone down. What would she say? That she missed her? That she felt abandoned? That she spent her days sitting in the same chair, looking at the same view, hoping that today might be different? No, she wouldn't beg for attention. She pushed herself up from the chair and walked to the kitchen, her eyes catching a small, forgotten packet of seeds on the counter. They had been there for months, maybe longer. A gift from a neighbor, one she had meant to plant but never found the motivation to. She picked them up, turning them over in her hand. A thought formed in her mind, quiet but persistent. What if I stopped waiting? Stepping outside, she felt the warmth of the afternoon sun on her skin. The garden was overgrown, neglected, much like she felt inside. But that could change. She grabbed a small trowel and knelt down, pressing her hands into the cool earth. At first it was just an attempt to fill the empty hours, a small distraction. But as the days passed, she found herself waking up with purpose. The act of tending to something, of nurturing, of watching things grow, became a source of quiet joy. She planted flowers, vegetables, anything she could get her hands on. She lost track of time, her hands covered in soil, her heart feeling lighter than it had in years. Then something unexpected happened. One afternoon, while she was watering her roses, her neighbor stopped by. "Elena, your garden looks beautiful. How did you get your roses to bloom like that?" The compliment made her smile. For the first time in a long time, someone was asking about her. Not about the children she had raised, not about who had or hadn't called, just her. She invited her neighbor in for tea. One conversation led to another, and soon she found herself part of a local gardening club. She met new friends, people who shared her love for the earth, who exchanged stories and laughter over pots of flowers and cups of coffee. She had found something she didn't even realize she was missing: connection. One evening, after a long day in the garden, her phone rang. She almost didn't hear it at first, too caught up in arranging fresh flowers in a vase. When she finally picked it up, she was surprised to see her daughter's name flashing on the screen. "Mum? Oh, sweetheart, it's good to hear your voice. You sound happy. What's your secret?" Elena chuckled, glancing at the dirt still under her fingernails. "I stopped waiting." That phone call wasn't the end of the distance between them, but it was a beginning. Because when she stopped waiting for others to bring her happiness, she found it within herself. And the moment she did, the world seemed to take notice. Staring at his cup of tea as steam curled into the air. The house felt colder than usual, though the thermostat was set the same as always. It wasn't the temperature, it was the emptiness. The chair across from him had once been occupied by his wife. She would hum softly as she stirred sugar into her tea, a habit she never broke even though she had long since stopped needing the extra sweetness. Now that chair remained empty. His son James used to visit often. When he was younger, they would sit at this very table for hours, talking about everything from school to dreams of the future. But life had a way of pulling people in different directions. James had gotten married, had children of his own, and slowly the calls and visits faded. At first, Mr. Peterson tried to rationalize it. He's busy. He has his own life. He'll call when he has time. But that time never seemed to come. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months. One evening, as he washed his dinner plate, one fork, one cup, he glanced at his phone sitting on the counter. No missed calls, no new messages. Frustration burned in his chest. He had been patient, he had waited, but how much longer? He grabbed his phone, thumb hovering over James's name in his contact list. The words formed in his mind before he could stop them. "Why don't you ever call me? Don't you care about me anymore?" But he didn't press dial. Something stopped him. A memory flickered. His own father, sitting at this very table years ago, sighing as he muttered, "I wonder why you don't visit more." Mr. Peterson had been young then, full of ambitions and responsibilities, never realizing the weight of those words. He had resented the guilt. Now he was on the other side of it. He placed the phone down, exhaling. No, guilt wouldn't bring James back. But maybe something else would. That night he sat at the table with a sheet of paper and a pen, hesitating for a moment before he began to write. "James, I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I miss our conversations. I miss hearing about your life. I just want you to know that I'm always here, and I'm proud of you, no matter what." He folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and mailed it the next morning. Days passed, then a week, then another. He told himself not to expect anything, but he checked his phone more often than usual. Then, one evening, as he sat reading by the window, his phone buzzed. He almost didn't recognize the number. It had been so long since James had called. "Dad?" His breath caught. "James, it's good to hear your voice. I got your letter, His son hesitated, clearing his throat. "I've been busy, and I didn't realize. I guess I just assumed you were fine." "I am," Mr. Peterson said, smiling softly. "But I've missed you." There was a pause on the other end. Then James spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "Me too, Dad. Me too." That phone call didn't erase the months of silence, but it opened a door. Because sometimes a gentle reminder of love does more than demands ever could. In the middle of her living room, her hands on her hips, staring at the mess her son, Daniel, had left behind. Toys were scattered across the floor, empty snack wrappers covered the coffee table, and a half-drunk cup of coffee sat forgotten on the counter. Daniel had been here earlier, not for a visit, not to spend time with her, but because he needed something. Again. "Mom, can you watch the kids for a few hours?" "Mom, I need some money. Just a little. I promise I'll pay you back." "Mom, I'm too busy to talk, but can you pick up some groceries for me?" It had become a pattern, one she hadn't noticed forming until it was too late. Every visit was a request, every phone call a need, and she, hoping to stay connected to him, had always said yes. At first, she told herself it was just temporary. He was stressed, raising kids, juggling work. She understood. But as the years passed, she realized something painful. Daniel didn't come to see her. He came to see what she could do for him, and he never said thank you. That night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling. A part of her wanted to believe that if she kept giving, kept proving her love, maybe he would finally appreciate her. But another part, the part that had been quietly whispering for years, told her the truth. She wasn't his mother anymore. She was his convenience. The next morning, as she sipped her tea, the phone rang. Daniel, right on schedule. "Mom, can you watch the kids today? Something came up." Her fingers tightened around the cup. The words were on the tip of her tongue. "Of course, sweetheart." But this time she hesitated. She thought about all the times she had dropped everything for him. The plans she had cancelled, the exhaustion she had ignored, the way he never even noticed. Then with a steady breath she spoke. "Daniel, I love you, but I'm not available today. I have plans." Silence. "Wait, what?" "But Mom, I really need you." "I understand, but I'm busy. I hope you find another solution." Another silence, then a sigh. Fine, I'll figure something out. And just like that, the call ended. She expected to feel guilt. Instead, she felt something else, relief. For the first time in years, she wasn't at his beck and call. She wasn't waiting around for scraps of his attention. She had drawn a line, and she wasn't going back. That afternoon, she signed up for a book club at the community center. The next day, she went to her first yoga class. She started reconnecting with old friends, people she had lost touch with while she was too busy being a mother first and a person second. A week later, Daniel called again. "Hey Mom, how have you been?" No request, no demand, just a question. It was small, but it was a start. Because when you start respecting yourself, others begin to follow. Glasses and turned the page of his book, but the words blurred together. The house was too quiet. Again. His children used to visit often, at least they did when they still needed him. When they were younger, they clung to his every word, looking to him for advice, guidance and reassurance. But now they barely looked up from their phones when they visited, if they visited at all. Last week, his daughter had stopped by. She had spent the entire time tapping away at her screen, only half listening to his stories. His son was no different. Quick visits, distracted conversations, an unspoken rush to leave as soon as possible. It wasn't anger he felt, it was something heavier, a quiet disappointment that settled deep in his chest. He had thought about saying something, about telling them how it hurt. But he knew how that would go. They would sigh, roll their eyes, maybe mutter something about being busy. And he didn't want their presence out of obligation. He wanted them to want to be there. So he made a decision. He wouldn't beg for their attention. He wouldn't guilt them into staying longer. Instead, he would do what he had always done, lead by example. The next time his children visited, he greeted them with a warm smile. "It's so good to see you." He didn't mention their long absence. He didn't complain about their distracted glances at their phones. Instead, he asked about their lives, really listened, nodding with genuine interest. When his son grumbled about work stress, he didn't dismiss it. He offered a few words of wisdom, simple, thoughtful, nothing that felt like a lecture. When his daughter sighed about her never-ending to-do list, he just chuckled. Life always feels too busy, until one day you look back and wish you had slowed down. No bitterness, no complaints, just quiet understanding. The shift was subtle at first. His son started staying a little longer, talking a little more. His daughter put her phone down mid-conversation instead of scrolling absent-mindedly. Then one evening, something happened that took him by surprise. His birthday came and went, no calls, no messages. He had expected it, but it still stung. That night, instead of dwelling on the loneliness, he sent a simple message to both of them. "I hope you're both doing well. I miss you. No guilt, no expectations, just truth." The next morning his phone rang. His son's name flashed on the screen. "Dad, I'm sorry I forgot your birthday. Can I come over this weekend?" It wasn't much, but it was something. And sometimes the smallest shifts lead to the biggest changes. Because respect isn't something you demand, it's something you embody. Side by side on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The evening breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. But inside, Mr. Carter's mind was restless. Their children hadn't called in weeks. They were grown now, with their own families, their own lives. He had always assumed that after retirement, they would visit often, drop by for dinner, call to ask for advice. But instead there was silence. Mrs. Carter, sensing his unease, placed a gentle hand on his. "You're thinking about them again, aren't you?" He sighed. "I just don't understand. We raised them with love. We supported them in everything, and now it's like they don't need us anymore." She smiled knowingly. "That's the point, isn't it? We raised them to be independent, and we did a good job." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he stared at the garden, neat, organized, well-maintained, just like their lives had always been. They had planned carefully for their retirement, downsizing their home, living within their means, never expecting financial support from their children. And maybe that was the problem. They had never been a burden. They had never needed anything. But deep down, wasn't there a part of him that wanted to be needed? Mrs. Carter chuckled, as if reading his thoughts. "Do you remember Tom and Linda?" He nodded. Their old friends had struggled financially after retirement, constantly leaning on their children for money, help with bills, even a place to stay. It had caused endless tension, resentment simmering on both sides. "Their kids visit every weekend," he muttered. "Out of love or out of obligation?" That question hung in the air. Mr. Carter exhaled slowly. "So what do we do? Just accept that they won't call?" Mrs. Carter squeezed his hand. "We live our lives, the way we always have, with dignity." And so they did. Instead of waiting for their children to visit, they started planning trips. Weekend getaways to the countryside, spontaneous dinners at their favorite restaurants, movie nights under the stars. Instead of sitting by the phone, Mr. Carter took up woodworking again, something he had always loved but never had time for. Mrs. Carter joined a local book club, making new friends who filled the house with laughter. They didn't ask their children for anything. They didn't call them with complaints. They simply lived. Then, one evening, as they were setting the table for dinner, the phone rang. Mrs. Carter answered, her voice warm. "Oh, hello, sweetheart. It's been a while." There was a pause, then their daughter's voice, hesitant but sincere. "You guys have been so busy lately. What have you been up to?" Mrs. Carter smiled at her husband before answering. "Oh, just enjoying life. You should come visit sometime, if you can keep up with us." That weekend, their daughter came over with her kids, not out of guilt, not out of obligation, but because she wanted to, because when you live with purpose, people are naturally drawn to you, even the ones who once forgot to call. The scent of paint and turpentine filling the air. In front of her was a half-finished canvas, bold strokes of color, vibrant yet unfinished, much like the life she had unknowingly put on hold. She dipped her brush into a deep shade of blue, but her hand hesitated. Her daughter Claire hadn't called in months. At first she had made excuses for her. She's busy. She has work. She has her own life to take care of. But the truth was harder to swallow. Claire had simply stopped making time for her. Evelyn had spent too many evenings waiting by the phone, rereading old messages, convincing herself that maybe, just maybe, today would be different. But it never was. One evening, after yet another silent dinner alone, she stood in front of the mirror and truly looked at herself. The woman staring back wasn't the same vibrant artist she once was. She was waiting, frozen in time, defined only by the absence of someone else's attention. And in that moment, she made a decision. She would stop waiting. The next morning, she dusted off her old paintbrushes, stretched a fresh canvas, and started painting again. At first, it felt strange, like revisiting an old version of herself. But as the days passed, something shifted. The strokes became bolder, the colors more daring. The more she painted, the more she remembered who she was before she became someone's forgotten mother. She joined a local art group, met fellow painters, displayed her work at small community events. She felt alive again, not because someone else had reminded her of her worth, but because she had reclaimed it herself. Then, one afternoon, as she was arranging her latest paintings for a local exhibit, her phone rang. Claire. Evelyn took a breath before answering. "Mom?" Claire's voice was hesitant. "I just saw your paintings online. You never told me you started painting again." Evelyn smiled, wiping a smudge of paint from her fingers. "I didn't think I needed to." Silence, then a small laugh. "You sound different, happier." "I am." Claire hesitated before speaking again. "I'd love to see your work in person. Maybe I could visit this weekend?" Evelyn's smile deepened. "I'd love that, sweetheart." That visit wouldn't erase the months of distance. It wouldn't undo the past, but it was a beginning. Because when you stop chasing after someone's love and start chasing your own joy, the right people will find their way back to you. Mr. Harold sat by the window, watching the world move on without him. The street outside was alive with laughter, conversations, and the steady rhythm of life. But inside his home, silence was his only companion. His children had once filled this house with noise, running through the halls, shouting for him to come play, sneaking cookies before dinner. Now, they were grown, busy with their own families, their own priorities. The phone barely rang anymore, and when it did, the calls were rushed, filled with empty promises of, "I'll visit soon, Dad." But soon never came. At first, he told himself it was fine. He could handle the quiet. But as the days stretched into months, he felt it, the slow, creeping weight of loneliness. It wasn't just about missing his children. It was about feeling forgotten, unneeded, as if the world had decided he had served his purpose and now had nothing left to offer. One afternoon, after another long, empty day, he turned on the TV. A news segment played about a local senior club hosting weekly gatherings, coffee mornings, book discussions, even a walking group. He scoffed, "That's not for me." But as the silence of the house pressed in around him, a different thought surfaced. Why not? The next morning, he hesitated at the door of the community center, debating whether to turn back. Then, a woman nearby, probably in her 70s just like him, gave him a knowing smile. "First time?" she asked. He nodded. "It's never too late to start something new," she said, holding the door open. He stepped inside. At first, it was awkward. He felt like an outsider, like a man who had spent too long in isolation to remember how to fit into a group. But then, someone handed him a cup of coffee. Someone else pulled up a chair. Before he knew it, he was talking, sharing stories, laughing, connecting. He had forgotten what it felt like to be surrounded by people who actually listened, who weren't in a hurry to leave. Weeks passed and the club became his lifeline. He joined the walking group, started a chess club with another retired teacher, even found himself looking forward to the book discussions. For the first time in years, he had a reason to get out of bed in the morning. Then one evening his phone rang. "Dad?" His son's voice was cautious, almost uncertain. I just realized I haven't called in a while. How have you been?" Harold smiled, looking around at the stack of books on his table, the walking shoes by the door, the notes for the next club meeting. "I've been great, son, really great." A pause, then his son spoke again. That's good to hear. Maybe I can visit this weekend?" Harold nodded, though his son couldn't see it. "I'd like that." But this time, he wasn't waiting. Because when you stop expecting others to fill the emptiness in your life and start filling it yourself, the loneliness fades. And the world starts noticing you again. Who remembers to call or who doesn't? You are not measured by how often you are visited. Your worth is timeless. Your dignity is yours to protect. Live fully, love yourself, and the respect you seek will follow.